In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Florissant, Missouri, dinner was on the stove, a typical Tuesday evening ritual. But inside one seemingly ordinary home, a truth was about to be revealed that would shatter the peace and lead to an act of desperate violence. Sarah Jenkins, a corrections officer at a state facility 80 miles to the south, parked her car in the driveway, the engine cooling as she gathered her things. The drive from the prison, a monotonous stretch of highway and county roads, was usually a buffer, a transition zone between the stark realities of her job and the comfortable predictability of her life with her husband, Mark. Tonight, the predictability felt thin. A low hum of anxiety had accompanied her throughout the shift, a sense of impending exposure she couldn't shake. The State Correctional Center, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire near Farmington, Missouri, felt a million miles away from the tidy lawns and two-story houses of Florissant. Yet the secrets she held within its walls were now threatening to spill out. Her husband Mark worked a steady job at a local manufacturing plant, his life defined by routine and practicality. Their home was a reflection of this, neat, orderly, filled with quiet expectation. Sarah often felt the weight of the contrast between her two worlds. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of Mark's cooking momentarily grounding her. The television was on low in the living room, tuned to a news channel. Mark wasn't visible immediately. The house felt unnervingly still despite the television's drone. Her uniform, heavy and slightly restrictive, felt alien in the soft glow of the living room lamp. She needed to change, to shed the skin of her professional life. But a tightness in her chest held her frozen in the hallway. The mail lay scattered on the small table by the door, junk mail mixed with bills. Everything seemed normal, yet the air was thick with unspoken tension. A feeling that had been building for weeks, perhaps months, unnoticed by Mark until recently. Sarah walked into the kitchen. Mark stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot. He didn't look up immediately. The mundane action felt charged, significant. She noted the set of his shoulders, the unusual rigidity. The sink was empty, dishes from breakfast neatly stacked in the drainer. His routine was intact, which somehow made the deviation from their usual evening greeting more pronounced. She cleared her throat. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. His eyes, usually warm and open, seemed distant, guarded. This was the moment. She felt it with a sickening certainty. The buffer zone had collapsed. The worlds had collided. Inside the secured perimeter of the state correctional facility near Farmington, life for Jessica Reyes followed a rigid, unchanging schedule, dictated by steel doors and concrete walls. Her days were measured in count times, meal trays, and brief, supervised interactions. The world outside, a place she hadn't touched in years, felt increasingly unreal. Her identity had been reduced to an inmate number, a statistic within a vast, impersonal system. Yet within this controlled environment, a profoundly personal and forbidden connection had formed, bending the rules of the institution in ways that were both dangerous and emotionally complex. It began subtly, as many such relationships do within the confined spaces of prison. Corrections Officer Sarah Jenkins was initially just another face in uniform, a figure of authority patrolling the blocks. Her demeanor was professional, quiet, observant. She performed her duties efficiently, rarely engaging in casual conversation with the inmates beyond necessary instructions. Jessica, serving a sentence for a nonviolent offense, observed the staff with the practiced detachment of someone navigating a difficult environment. Officers like Sarah were part of the landscape, figures to be managed, not connected with. But over time, small interactions began to shift the dynamic. A brief, unexpected moment of empathy from Officer Jenkins during a difficult day. A question asked with genuine, albeit reserved, concern. These were tiny cracks in the imposing facade of the guard-inmate barrier. In an environment starved for authentic human connection, even these small gestures held immense weight. Jessica found herself anticipating Officer Jenkins's shift, noticing her movements on the block. The formal language between them softened marginally, replaced by a subtle acknowledgement of shared space and shared time, however disparate their roles. The physical closeness inherent in the job, passing in hallways, supervision during yard time or meals, provided opportunities for nonverbal communication, a glance, a shared moment of quiet observation. These small allowances, seemingly insignificant, were deviations from policy, subtle tests of boundaries. Neither woman explicitly acknowledged what was happening, but the unspoken connection grew, fueled by the isolation of their respective roles. One confined physically, the other confined by the rigid structure of her profession and perhaps her life outside. The institution, designed to separate and control, had inadvertently become the crucible for a dangerous hidden intimacy. A secret that began within the sterile walls, but carried the potential for destruction far beyond them. The forbidden connection between Sarah Jenkins and Jessica Reyes deepened quietly within the structured confines of the correctional facility. What began as subtle glances and brief, hushed words evolved into clandestine meetings in less supervised areas. A quiet corner of the laundry room, a brief moment alone in a supply closet, interactions stretched beyond necessity during escort duties. These encounters were fraught with risk, each touch, each whispered confidence a potential end to Sarah's career, and further complications for Jessica's sentence. The clinical environment of the prison became the unlikely backdrop for a relationship built on secrecy and the shared thrill of breaching established boundaries. Policies were systematically disregarded. Communication methods forbidden by regulation were employed. Notes were passed discreetly during pat-downs or cell checks. Small, unauthorized items exchanged. The professional line blurred, then vanished entirely, replaced by a bond that defied the institutional purpose. Sarah's life in Florissant, the quiet home with Mark, the routine that had once defined her, began to feel increasingly distant. A different reality she inhabited only when she wasn't at work. The intensity of the hidden relationship within the prison walls consumed her focus, demanding constant vigilance and deception. For Jessica, the relationship offered an escape, a connection that mitigated the harsh realities of her confinement. It was a dangerous gamble, but the emotional payoff, however illicit, felt worth the potential cost. The dependency between them grew, fueled by the isolation of their circumstances. They existed in a bubble of shared secrecy, a fragile world constructed from stolen moments and whispered promises. Neither seemed to fully grasp the gravity of the consequences should their actions be discovered, either by the prison authorities or, more perilously, by those in Sarah's outside life. The most profound consequence of their illicit affair arrived unexpectedly. Despite the precautions taken within the restrictive environment, Jessica Reyes discovered she was pregnant. The clinical reality of this biological fact crashed into the carefully constructed secrecy of their relationship. A life was growing, a tangible, undeniable result of their forbidden acts, and its existence could not be contained within the prison walls. This biological truth became a ticking clock, an imminent threat to the fragile balance Sarah maintained between her two worlds, and a catalyst for a series of events that would have devastating repercussions outside the prison gates, reaching directly into the quiet suburban street where Sarah Jenkins lived with her husband. The reality of Jessica Reyes's pregnancy was a seismic shock that reverberated through the clandestine world Sarah Jenkins had built within the correctional facility. A pregnancy test, smuggled in and used in secret, yielded the unambiguous result. The clinical fact was undeniable. Life was forming inside the secured perimeter. This development elevated the risk exponentially. A hidden relationship could perhaps remain hidden indefinitely with sufficient caution. A pregnancy, however, was a physical, undeniable state that would eventually become impossible to conceal, particularly within the hyper-regulated environment of a prison, subject to medical checkups and constant observation. Sarah was acutely aware of the implications. Discovery by the prison authorities would mean immediate termination, potentially criminal charges related to her conduct, and disciplinary action against Jessica. Discovery by Mark was an entirely different and in some ways more terrifying prospect. Her life outside the prison, the life she had carefully kept separate, was directly threatened by this biological link to her secret world. The need to manage this crisis consumed her. She and Jessica discussed options in hushed, urgent tones during their brief, stolen moments. How could they explain this? How could they conceal it? The questions had no easy answers. Sarah became increasingly withdrawn at home. The usual post-work decompression, the sharing of mundane details about their days, ceased. Mark noted. His initial concern shifted to quiet observation, then to suspicion. Sarah's phone became a source of tension. She kept it close, her responses to texts and calls guarded. Late nights spent supposedly working on paperwork or dealing with issues at the facility became more frequent. Mark, a man of routine and directness, found Sarah's evasiveness unsettling. Their previously open communication faltered, replaced by awkward silences and unanswered questions hanging in the air of their Florissant home. He began to pay closer attention to her schedule, the details of her work stories which seemed increasingly vague or contradictory. Small discrepancies mounted, a gut feeling, an intuition that something was fundamentally wrong, began to take root. He checked phone bills, noted unusual numbers or times. He observed her reactions when certain topics came up. The comfortable familiarity of their shared life started to feel like a performance, with Sarah playing a part he no longer recognized. His suspicion grew from a low hum to a persistent, unsettling buzz. He knew she was hiding something significant, something that was fundamentally altering the landscape of their marriage, and the quiet investigation he conducted in their home was about to collide with the explosive secret she kept 80 miles away at the correctional facility. Mark Jenkins's suspicion hardened into a grim certainty. His quiet investigation into Sarah's altered behavior yielded increasingly disturbing clues. He noticed financial irregularities, small sums withdrawn or spent without explanation. He found unfamiliar phone numbers in their recent call logs that weren't associated with her family or colleagues he knew. Her explanation for everything was always vague, tied back to unspecified work issues. The distance between them widened with each evasive answer. The comfortable silence they once shared became a tense void filled with unspoken accusations. He started looking for tangible evidence, something undeniable. His search led him to Sarah's work bag one evening. The bag, usually left by the door, contained a jumble of official documents, personal items, and correctional facility paperwork. He searched through it methodically, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. Tucked inside a small pouch, amidst pens and notebooks, he found them, a series of printed text messages. The language was intimate, affectionate, filled with terms of endearment. The recipient was listed only as J. The content spoke of longing, of stolen moments, of a life together outside of confinement. It was undeniably evidence of an emotional and likely physical affair. But the text messages contained more than just expressions of illicit love. They referred to a baby, to due dates, to how we will manage this. One message mentioned the clinic appointment. Another discussed names. The context was horrifyingly clear. The woman on the other end, J, was not only Sarah's lover, but was also pregnant, and the messages strongly implied Sarah was involved in planning for the child. The clinical details of the messages, starkly laid out on the printed page, painted a picture of calculated deception and profound betrayal that went far beyond infidelity. Mark understood instantly that J was not someone from outside the prison, but someone inside, someone Sarah had met through her work. The reality of a relationship with an inmate, coupled with a pregnancy, was almost unfathomable in its complexity and its threat to everything he thought he knew about his wife. The discovery was a violent rupture in the fabric of his perceived reality. His world, which had felt stable and predictable, fractured instantly. When Sarah arrived home that evening, the dinner on the stove, the quiet normalcy she had hoped to find was gone. Mark confronted her, the printed messages in his hand. The confrontation was not a dramatic shouting match initially, but a tense, strained exchange in the quiet kitchen. Mark's voice was low, controlled, asking clinical questions based on the evidence he held. Sarah's initial attempts at denial crumbled quickly under the weight of the printed words. She confessed, the truth spilling out in fragments: the relationship, the inmate, the pregnancy. The air in the house became thick, heavy with the enormity of the revealed secret. The clinical facts of the situation, the correctional officer, the inmate, the illicit pregnancy, stood in stark contrast to the raw, devastating emotional fallout now unleashed in the quiet suburban home. The fuse had been lit. The quiet confrontation in the Florissant kitchen escalated rapidly. The clinical revelation of the affair and the inmate's pregnancy shattered the fragile composure Mark had maintained. His initial questions, measured and detached, gave way to a surge of emotion, disbelief, anger, profound betrayal. Sarah's fragmented confession offered no solace, only confirmation of the devastating truth. The argument moved from the kitchen into the living room, voices rising from strained whispers to sharp, Karlargatan accusations. The mundane objects of their life together, the sofa, the coffee table, family photographs, became silent witnesses to the unraveling of their marriage. Details about the relationship emerged in the heat of the argument, painting a picture of calculated deceit that had been happening for months, right under his nose. Sarah spoke of her feelings for Jessica, of the impossibility of the situation, but her words did little to temper Mark's rage. The fact that this was not just an affair but an affair with a woman incarcerated in the facility where Sarah worked, involving a forbidden pregnancy, was a layer of betrayal he couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a complete breach of trust on every level: personal, professional, moral. The quiet, dependable life he thought they shared was a lie. The argument reached a volatile peak. Objects were swept from tables. Voices became shouts. The emotional restraint that had characterized their initial conversation evaporated, replaced by raw, exposed pain and fury. The details of the inmate's pregnancy were particularly incendiary, representing a future Sarah had been planning that fundamentally excluded him. A life being created within the prison walls that was a direct consequence of her lies. The contrast between the life they had built in Florissant and the life she had been secretly building within the concrete walls of the correctional facility was unbearable. In a sudden, violent act, Mark Jenkins attacked Sarah. The specifics of the assault would later be documented meticulously by forensic investigators, detailing the nature of the blows, the weapon used, a common household item seized in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The struggle was brief, desperate. The sounds of the violence were muffled by the suburban night, unheard by neighbors. The house, moments before filled with the sounds of a terrible argument, fell silent. Sarah Jenkins lay still amidst the overturned furniture and scattered remnants of their shattered life. The dinner Mark had been cooking earlier began to burn on the stove, filling the house with a acrid smoke, a stark sensory detail marking the end of their shared history, and the beginning of a grim new reality. The quiet normalcy was irrevocably broken. The 911 call came in just after 8:30 p.m. Mark Jenkins, his voice trembling and disjointed, reported that something had happened at his residence in Florissant, Missouri. Responding officers from the Florissant Police Department arrived within minutes to find the front door ajar and the smell of smoke emanating from within. They entered the house cautiously. The scene inside was immediately recognized as a violent crime. Furniture was overturned in the living room. The kitchen showed signs of disarray, and the acrid smell of burnt food hung in the air. Sarah Jenkins was found in the living room. Responding officers secured the scene, initiating the protocol for a homicide investigation. Yellow crime tape was quickly deployed, cordoning off the property from the quiet suburban street. Neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights, gathered behind the tape, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. This kind of violence simply did not happen in their neighborhood. Mark Jenkins was present at the scene, seemingly in a state of shock or dissociation. He was cooperative but offered little coherent information initially. He was secured by officers while the preliminary investigation began. Detectives and forensic investigators were called to the scene. Their work was meticulous, clinical. Every detail was documented, photographed, catalogued. The position of the body, the nature of the injuries, the presence of a weapon found nearby, a heavy object consistent with blunt force trauma, all provided initial clues. The investigators noted the signs of a struggle, indicating the attack was not entirely unexpected or occurred during incapacitation, but rather during a violent confrontation. The burning food on the stove was noted as a detail that pointed to the time frame of the incident, suggesting it occurred during the dinner hour. The house itself became a repository of evidence. The disarray spoke of the violence, but other elements pointed to the life lived there. Family photos on the mantelpiece. Mundane objects of daily existence contrasted sharply with the scene of death. Initial interviews with Mark Jenkins were conducted. His account was fragmented, emotional, but consistent in placing him at the scene and admitting involvement in an altercation. The motive, however, remained unclear to the initial responding officers. They knew a corrections officer was dead, her husband was involved, and the scene suggested a domestic dispute gone horrifically wrong. But the complex web of secrets leading to this moment had not yet been revealed. The investigation was just beginning to peel back the layers of deception that originated far from Florissant. The crime scene analysis in Florissant continued for hours, the meticulous work of forensic investigators seeking to reconstruct the events that led to Sarah Jenkins's death. Every object, every stain, every disturbance in the home was potential evidence. The weapon, identified as a heavy metal object from the kitchen, was carefully collected and sent for processing. Blood spatter patterns were documented, providing silent testimony to the violence of the attack. The position of Sarah's body and the nature of her injuries were crucial for the medical examiner's preliminary assessment. The medical examiner transported Sarah Jenkins' body to the forensic laboratory for autopsy. The autopsy report would later provide the definitive clinical details of her death, the precise cause, the extent of her injuries, and a more accurate estimation of the time of death, corroborating the timeline suggested by the burning food. This clinical examination would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, presenting the stark, undeniable physical evidence of the fatal assault. The report detailed multiple blunt force trauma injuries, consistent with being struck repeatedly with the recovered weapon. Meanwhile, detectives began the process of gathering context. They learned Sarah Jenkins was a corrections officer. This immediately raised questions. Was the murder related to her job? Had she encountered threats? Interviews began with her colleagues at the correctional facility near Farmington. Initial conversations focused on her professional conduct, her relationships with coworkers, any known issues with inmates. These interviews painted a picture of a generally competent, quiet officer. But some colleagues noted recent changes in her demeanor, a preoccupation, a distraction. Simultaneously, detectives delved into the digital lives of both Sarah and Mark Jenkins. Phones, computers, and other electronic devices were seized from the Florissant home under warrant. Forensic analysis of these devices was critical. Text messages, emails, browsing history. These digital footprints could reveal conversations and activities unknown to anyone but Sarah and Mark. The search focused on communications that might shed light on the couple's relationship, any recent conflicts, or anything connecting Sarah's home life to her work environment in an unusual way. This digital evidence held the key to unlocking the motive, the hidden truth that had precipitated the violence in the quiet suburban home. The discovery of specific communications would soon drastically shift the direction of the investigation, moving it beyond a simple domestic homicide. The digital forensic analysis of Sarah and Mark Jenkins' electronic devices yielded the crucial evidence needed to establish motive. Investigators meticulously sifted through thousands of text messages, emails, and call logs. The initial focus was on communications between Sarah and Mark, looking for signs of escalating conflict. While these showed increasing tension and Mark's growing suspicion, they didn't fully explain the extreme violence. The breakthrough came from Sarah's phone. Among the routine work-related communications and personal contacts, detectives discovered a hidden thread, extensive, intimate message exchanges with a contact saved cryptically as J. Tracing this contact revealed it belonged to Jessica Reyes, an inmate at the very correctional facility where Sarah Jenkins was employed. The content of these messages was explicit, detailing a long-term clandestine romantic and sexual relationship conducted within the confines of the prison. This discovery alone provided a powerful potential motive, rooted in betrayal and infidelity, shattering the image of Sarah's seemingly ordinary suburban life. But the messages revealed a far more complex and incendiary truth. Subsequent texts between Sarah and Jessica made increasingly frequent and urgent references to a pregnancy. Discussions about symptoms, medical visits, conducted within the prison medical unit, and the logistics of managing a pregnancy while incarcerated, were laid bare. The messages included fearful speculation about discovery and plans for the future that implicitly involved Sarah. One specific exchange detailed a positive pregnancy test result from several months prior, confirming the timeline. The clinical reality of the pregnancy, documented in their own words, was undeniable. Further investigation corroborated these findings. Inmate medical records from the correctional facility were subpoenaed, confirming that Jessica Reyes was indeed pregnant and had been for several months. This undeniable fact, coupled with the intimate communications between the corrections officer and the inmate discussing the pregnancy as their shared reality, provided the complete picture of the devastating secret Sarah had been keeping. The motive for the murder crystallized with chilling clarity. Mark Jenkins discovered his wife was not only having an affair with a female inmate, but that inmate was pregnant, a direct result of their illicit relationship. This constellation of betrayals, exposed in the stark text messages and confirmed by institutional records, was the catalyst for the violence that erupted in Florissant. The investigation, rooted in the quiet suburban home, had led back to the hidden world within the prison walls, connecting the two disparate locations through a chain of forbidden actions and their fatal consequences. With the motive firmly established by the compelling digital and medical evidence, the investigation moved swiftly towards bringing charges. Mark Jenkins was formally arrested and charged with the murder of his wife Sarah Jenkins. The evidence presented to the prosecutor, the crime scene documentation, the medical examiner's findings, Mark's presence and initial statements, and critically, the extensive communications between Sarah and Jessica Reyes detailing their affair and the pregnancy, built a strong case. The narrative was clear. Mark discovered a devastating, complex betrayal and reacted with lethal violence. The legal proceedings began in the local courthouse, a stark contrast to the suburban street where the crime occurred, and the correctional facility where the affair originated. Mark Jenkins appeared stoic during his arraignment, entering a plea of not guilty. The charges read aloud in the formal language of the court outlined the act, the date, and the location, bringing the grim reality into the public domain. News of the case spread quickly. The sensational details of a corrections officer, an inmate, and a murder in a quiet suburb captivating attention. Witnesses were interviewed at length by both the prosecution and the defense. Neighbors in Florissant spoke of Sarah and Mark as a quiet couple, seemingly unremarkable, highlighting the shock felt throughout the community. Colleagues from the correctional facility offered perspectives on Sarah's professionalism, with some acknowledging her recent change in behavior, a new guardedness. Brief, poignant statements from those who knew the individuals involved hinted at the unseen pressures and secrets beneath the surface of their lives. One colleague was quoted as noting Sarah seemed under a lot of stress in the weeks leading up to her death. The defense strategy began to emerge, focusing on Mark's state of mind at the time of the discovery and the act. They argued the extreme provocation caused by the revelation of the affair and the pregnancy, painting a picture of a man pushed beyond his limits by an unimaginable betrayal. The prosecution, conversely, focused on the premeditation implied by the violence and the calculated destruction of a human life, regardless of the circumstances of the motive. The stage was set for a legal battle that would delve into the intimate, devastating details unearthed by the investigation, presenting them in the clinical, procedural environment of the courtroom. The fate of Mark Jenkins now rested on how a jury would interpret the complex interplay of secrecy, betrayal, and lethal rage that originated in the most unexpected of places and ended violently at home. The trial of Mark Jenkins commenced, transforming the quiet courtroom into a space for presenting the grim narrative of the crime. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, presenting the forensic evidence from the Florissant home, the documented scene, the recovered weapon, the medical examiner's detailed account of Sarah Jenkins' injuries and cause of death. Each piece of physical evidence was presented clinically, building an undeniable picture of the fatal assault. The jury was shown photographs of the disarray in the house, the stark contrast between the signs of struggle and the remnants of a seemingly ordinary life. The heart of the prosecution's case lay in the motive, revealed through the digital evidence. The text messages between Sarah Jenkins and Jessica Reyes, detailing their affair and the inmate's pregnancy, were read aloud or displayed for the jury. The intimate language, the planning around the pregnancy, the clear tale of correctional protocol and personal vows, these communications presented the context for Mark's actions. The medical records confirming Jessica Reyes' pregnancy were entered into evidence, solidifying the timeline and the reality of the child's impending birth. The clinical facts of the illicit relationship and its consequence were presented alongside the brutal facts of the murder. The defense focused on provocation, arguing that Mark Jenkins, a man with no prior history of violence, was driven to a momentary, uncontrollable rage by the shock and magnitude of his wife's betrayal, an affair compounded by a forbidden pregnancy with an inmate. They presented testimony attempting to portray Mark as a stable, ordinary individual, whose actions were a direct result of extreme emotional disturbance caused by the unimaginable truth he discovered that night. They did not deny he caused Sarah's death but sought to redefine the act within the legal framework, aiming for a lesser charge than first-degree murder. Key witnesses included investigators who described the scene and the evidence collection process. Colleagues from the correctional facility provided glimpses into Sarah's professional life and the changing atmosphere surrounding her. Expert witnesses interpreted the forensic findings and discussed the psychological impact of profound betrayal. The trial dissected the final moments in the Jenkins home, attempting to understand the precise sequence of events and the state of mind of everyone involved. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Mark Jenkins was found guilty of murder. The specific degree of the charge and his eventual sentence reflected the jury's interpretation of the evidence presented, balancing the act of violence with the context of the devastating revelations that preceded it. Following the verdict and sentencing of Mark Jenkins, the legal proceedings concluded, But the human and emotional impacts of the case lingered, rippling outwards from the quiet street in Florissant and the secure perimeter near Farmington. Jessica Reyes remained incarcerated, the reality of her pregnancy now intertwined with the tragic death of Sarah Jenkins, the corrections officer who had become her forbidden lover. The child, born while Jessica was still in custody, became a living evidence of the secret relationship and its devastating consequences. The future of the child, born into this complex and tragic circumstance, raised profound questions for the legal system and social services. The correctional facility near Farmington conducted an internal investigation into how the relationship between a corrections officer and an inmate could develop and escalate to the point of pregnancy without detection for so long. Policy reviews were undertaken, security measures reevaluated, and staff training emphasized the critical importance of professional boundaries and the severe consequences of violating them. The incident served as a stark reminder of the inherent risks within the carceral environment, and the human element that can sometimes override even the most stringent regulations. The facility, a place built on control and separation, had inadvertently become the catalyst for a personal tragedy that spilled violently into the outside world. In Florissant, the neighborhood slowly returned to its semblance of quiet normalcy, but the memory of the crime, the flashing lights and the yellow tape remained. The house on the tree-lined street became a silent monument to the hidden turmoil that had erupted within its walls. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the Jenkinses, struggling to reconcile the image of the ordinary couple with the grim reality of the murder. The unexpected intersection of the institutional world of the prison and the private world of the suburban home left a haunting impression, a reminder that secrets, particularly those that violate fundamental boundaries, carry the potential for unforeseen and devastating consequences. The death of Sarah Jenkins, the conviction of Mark Jenkins, and the birth of Jessica Reyes' child closed the formal chapters of the case. But the story left behind a pervasive sense of loss and unanswered questions. It was a narrative of how isolation and forbidden connection in one environment could collide with expectation and betrayal in another, resulting in irreversible destruction. The lives of everyone touched by the secret, Sarah, Mark, Jessica, their families, the child, the communities they inhabited, were permanently altered. The quiet devastation of a secret affair, its biological consequence, and the fatal reaction to its discovery served as a grim, haunting testament to the unpredictable and often destructive power of human relationships, pushed beyond their breaking point, particularly when they intersect with the rigid, unforgiving structures of institutional confinement.